was Chatting with Chops. We're going to make homemade bread. Just as a disclaimer, I'm just a regular home cook. I have no real baking experience or training or anything like that. Also wanted to let you know, no products or equipment that you see in this video are being sponsored or anything like that. Always keep in mind, if you have suggestions for future bakes, to let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear about it, and definitely I would love it if you'd like and subscribe and hit the bell for future notifications. And then let's get started. So the first thing, I'm just using a regular recipe off of the internet that I've kind of modified myself. What is basically the recipe? I'll put all the information in the comments below. It basically wants you to start with just regular baking yeast. You just use 1 packet, and I'm going to be putting that in my bowl. And then it wants you to take 2 1/4 cups of warm water in with the yeast. So we've done that. And then you put a little bit of sugar in there for the yeast to eat. Now I usually wait 10 minutes for my yeast to make sure that it's growing and it's doing well and everything. So if you take the just set your timer for 10 minutes. And so we're going to continue with the recipe. I showed you what the yeast looks like once it's bubbling and foaming. And the basic recipe basically says you need to add your sugar, which is 1/4 cup of sugar. And then you add your salt. And I did like the cooking programs, I did all the fancy little glasses. And then you add your oil. A lot of recipes will say just regular oil. You can use, for the most part, whatever kind of oil you want to use. You can use canola, or we use extra virgin olive oil just because we like that better in this house, and it's a little bit more nutritional. Now you're going to add your flour. And I always use my dough hook for this, even starting out, because sometimes it can get really thick really quickly. Alright. And this is 4 cups of flour is what you put in to start off with. I'm going to add all of this in, and then I'll bring you guys closer so you can see everything that's going on. And basically at this point what you're trying to do is make it where it's starts to be bread consistency as far as like your dough. It might still be really sticky, but you're just trying to kind of get it started as dough. And I don't really have any specific speed or slowness, or I'm just using the measuring cup because it's easier to get it out of the bowl. Make sure you get your full 4 cups in there. And I like to run it kind of slow because otherwise you can spit flour all over the kitchen. I'm sure that there are quick breads out there, but they don't taste as good to me as homemade bread. And then the next part of what you're doing is you're still letting all of that flour kind of mix in. And then the recipe says for you to start adding in an additional cup and a half of flour just to get it to the right consistency. So I have another 2 cups of flour in this bowl that I'm just going to slowly add. Because right now, as you saw earlier, it's way too sticky to try and knead or roll out or anything. I did want to point out too, a lot of the times with recipes, you can print them off and do exactly what the directions say, and that's usually what I do on the very first recipe. The very first time I cook that particular recipe is I try my best to do exactly what the directions say. But after that, if there's things that you want to change or you want to tweak or make it your own, there's nothing wrong with that. That's the fun of baking. You're experimenting. So And this one actually, they want you to use bread flour. I use just regular white all-purpose flour. You can use wheat flour. Now, I will say I've never tried it with almond flour before. That would be even healthier. Any high-tech stuff that gives me a remote control or anything. At this point, when it's really, really wet, I like to turn it off and bring my dough hook up a little bit where all of the dough is just really, really wet. And that's where I like to try and sprinkle the flour kind of down in everything. Because while you've got the dough hook going, it's kind of taking the flour where it wants to go. So if you do it that way, you can kind of get the flour almost kind of underneath everything. And then when you have just a little bit of left, then you can just kind of drop it down in there. So basically at this point, you've just got somewhat, it's still a little bit sticky. I always say I'd rather have my dough too wet at this point than too dry, because nobody wants to eat dry bread. And for kneading, I always like to make sure that I don't have any jewelry on, because I don't know about you, but I don't like having to try and clean out dough out of my wedding ring or any rings that I have on. Alright, so you're just going to spread a little bit of flour onto the counter, or if you have a fancy pie mat, they sell great baking mats that you can use. Some people like to use a cutting board because it's easier to clean up. Just use the counter because it seems to be just as easy to clean up as anything else. And you basically want to get your bread out of the bowl. And the more you get out of the bowl, the more that you're going to, the bigger your loaves will be. So that's always wonderful. And again, you see there's still some spots on here that are very sticky. But again, as I was saying before, I like for my dough to be stickier at this point than too dry. The recipe says that you should knead for 5 to 7 minutes. You've got your timer with you. And yes, I usually end up with all kinds of stuff all over my timer. So the next step is you've got your bread. You've spent 5 minutes washing all the dough off of your hands and the flour. So basically at this point what you want to do is some cooking spray, or if you'd rather just use real butter, whatever you can to grease a bigger bowl. That way the dough doesn't stick to the bowl. So you need something like some butter or cooking spray is what I use. And just put it on there really good. And then you want to take your bread that's sitting on your counter, and you're going to put it in the bowl, and you're going to flip it once so that the grease from the bowl, the cooking oil that you just put in there, kind of gets all over it. That way it doesn't stick in any way. And then you want to take a clean towel and put it over the top of it, and just put it in a spot where it's not going to get hit or banged or knocked over or anything. And you'll set your timer for an hour and a half. Alright, well that was an hour and a half, and you see here's the bowl with the towel over it. I didn't peek or anything, so we're just going to take the towel off, and that is some beautiful looking bread dough. At this point what you want to do is sprinkle a little bit of flour again. Make sure that you don't have any of your jewelry on unless you want to clean out bread dough out of your jewelry. And then you just flop him out. He should come out pretty easily since you greased the bowl. And at this point I just make sure he's covered in flour again. Just make sure he's nice and soft. Don't ask me why he's suddenly a he. Make sure everything's all nice and pretty. And then this particular bread recipe makes 2 loaves. I'm sure you could cut it in half, and if you only wanted one. Bread usually freezes pretty good. And then I'm just going to take this is a little like scraper, but you can use a fancy bread cutter or You know, it doesn't need to be anything sharp or anything like that, but really all you're trying to do is just cut the dough in half since you want to make 2 loaves. If you have a really big loaf pan, you could leave it in one. I usually like to have 2 loaves because we really love our bread around here. And at this point, you're just going to take one of your loaf pans, take the half of the dough, and I usually just try and get it in kind of a loaf shape. Make sure that there's not like a bunch of flour on him, because that will affect it when it starts to cook. Just kind of put him down in the pan. Make sure there's... Alright, well that was an hour and a half, and you see here's the bowl with the towel over it. I didn't peek or anything, so we're just going to take the towel off, and that is some beautiful looking bread dough. At this point, what you want to do is sprinkle a little bit of flour again. Make sure that you don't have any of your jewelry on unless you want to clean out bread dough out of your jewelry. And then you just flop him out. He should come out pretty easily since you've greased the bowl. And at this point, I just make sure he's covered in flour again. Just make sure he's nice and soft. Don't ask me why he's suddenly a he. Make sure everything's all nice and pretty. And then this particular bread recipe makes 2 loaves. I'm sure you could cut it in half, and if you only wanted one. Bread usually freezes pretty good. And then I'm just going to take this is a little like scraper, but you can use a fancy bread cutter, or you know, it doesn't need to be anything sharp or anything like that, but really all you're trying to do is just cut the dough in half since you want to make 2 loaves. If you have a really big loaf pan, you could leave it in one. I usually like to have 2 loaves because we really love our bread around here. And at this point, you're just going to take one of your loaf pans, take the half of the dough, and I usually just try and get it in kind of a loaf shape. Make sure that there's not like a bunch of flour on him, because that will affect it when it starts to cook. Just kind of put him down in the pan. Make sure there's... Basically at this point, this recipe calls for you to cover them up again, so that's how they look. Just laying in their loaf pans. You can see I don't have fine fancy equipment. I don't, at this point, don't even have matching loaf pans, but you don't need to. And then you just cover them back up again. Get some of my flour out of the way so it doesn't get on my towel. But just cover them both back up again and let them sit for an hour and a half. Alright, we waited the hour and a half for the second rise, and this is what they look like. Let me turn on a little bit more light so y'all can see well. And you see what I mean about making sure that there wasn't any excess flour on the top or anything, so that they're nice and smooth and pretty, because that's basically how they're going to look when they come out. So we're going to put them in the oven, and the recipe says 375 degrees for about 30 to 35 minutes. Again, I usually leave them in for the full 35 minutes just to make sure they're cooked all the way through. So let's put them in the oven. My big fancy industrial oven here. And I like to put mine all the way in the back. Don't ask me why, I just like them better back there. Alright, they are in, and they're going to cook for 30 to 35 minutes. So, I said in the beginning of this video that I am not an expert baker. I don't have any master classes experience or anything like that. And I'm going to show you what happens when you don't do one of the steps that I didn't do. If you look on my bread, you will see on this one the lumps that it has. It looks like it's been stung by bees. That's because I forgot to punch the dough down before we rolled it out into the baking pans. You're supposed to punch it down, and that's what happens is it gets air caught and causes it to have air bubbles in the dough. It doesn't affect the taste at all, it just makes it look less pretty. So let me turn this off so you guys can hear me good. But it makes the bread turned out really, really pretty. It just is a little lumpy. It looks like I said, like it's been stung by a bee. This one, evidently, I was able to get more of the bubbles out because I don't see, there's one little spot right there. But see what I was saying about when you go to put it in the pans, look to see how the surface looks to you, because that's how it's going to be when it comes out. So basically, you would normally just let these cool for a little while, but I have someone who really is wanting a slice now, so we're going to let it cool for a few minutes and then we'll have a taste tester. Okay, so I have a taste tester that's interested in getting into the bread and seeing how I did. It's extremely warm, but she does not want to wait. So she's going to be able to tell us whether it's any good or not. Hopefully I'll get lucky and she won't say it tastes terrible. This is my daughter, by the way. And just to let you know, this bread is completely vegan. We used all vegan ingredients, so there's nothing in here that a vegan wouldn't be able to have. And you see, it is very crumbly when it's still warm. It's very, very crumbly to try and cut it then. So that's why it is so crumbly. But we'll get her to test it out and see if it's any good. So what do you think, Jessica?
Good. It's still hot.
Alright, well, if you liked this video, please like and subscribe and hit the bell button so you'll get notifications of future videos, and let me know down in the comments section what you might want me to do more videos of, or if you liked this one, and I will make sure to put the complete recipe down in the description box below. Talk to you later. Here's our last little entry on making homemade bread. I wanted you guys to be able to see the density of the bread. Sometimes that changes how you are, how you kneaded it, on how thick it is or dense it is. But this is the final product, and I usually just wrap mine up in aluminum foil. I don't have a bread box, so I just wrap mine in aluminum foil, and quite honestly, it doesn't last as long around here.